It saved my life, completely saved my life, because they gave me the tools to go forward.
I'd probably have committed suicide, I really would. If I hadn't come here, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I really wouldn't.
Two women broken by domestic abuse, given the chance to rebuild here at this Sheffield refuge. We've changed their names and voices to hide their identities. Michaela arrived with nothing. Years of being controlled had left her unable to function at the most basic level.
It was like every movement I did, he knew. He knew when I was in and when I was out. If I put rubbish in the bin, he used to go through the bin and see what I was chucking away. Knew when the heating was on in the house. I felt so trapped.
Money was one of the most effective weapons her former partner used against her.
He always used to say, "You wouldn't be able to afford to live without me." It petrified me. The news was all about the gas and the electric bills, people not being able to put the heating on. How could I take my child from a house where there was heating, there was food, the bills were being paid to unknown?
In its 50th year of existence, Women's Aid say their annual audit of domestic abuse services reveals the ongoing impact of the cost of living crisis. 58% of organisations surveyed felt survivors had experienced economic abuse more frequently. 63% said survivors had been unable to leave perpetrators because of the cost of living. And those same pressures are directly affecting the ability of the organisations themselves to help victims and survivors.
We're in one of our refuges that we provide at Sheffield Women's Aid.
And the women are in crisis when they come here?
Absolutely. You know, they're at the point where they're about to be really seriously injured, have been really seriously injured, you know, at risk of being murdered. So this is absolutely a point of crisis, women needing to access refuge.
Women's Aid say there is a shortage of more than 1,200 beds across England. Here they say that's just one part of a patchwork of inadequate support for victims.
You know, there's pressure on our bed spaces, and obviously when we've got somebody who is just waiting to move out, but they know that they can't afford to, then we are acutely aware of the people who are waiting to come into our services. And actually what we then see is they will go into temporary accommodation that doesn't have the support that we offer. And actually we know that some women will choose to go back to their relationships rather than be in temporary accommodation.
Across England, the audit found an estimated 61% of referrals to refuge services were rejected, the majority because there was just no capacity to support the victim. 44% of organisations reported providing a service that should be provided by a statutory agency like the local authority. And now today, a stark warning from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner Nicole Jacobs. In a letter to the Communities Secretary Michael Gove, she outlines a bleak and dangerous landscape ahead.
A perilous situation has become a state of crisis, the Commissioner writes. With councils under huge pressure and with no legal obligation to fund most domestic abuse services, she fears many of those services could be reduced or cut altogether. The consequence? Well, on that, she's blunt. She says without long-term financial support, women and child victims of domestic violence could be at greater risk of being harmed or even being killed.
I could see the black in his eyes. I was buffering all his anger, all his temper. If his stuff wasn't ready, if his stuff wasn't in the wardrobe, wasn't ironed, if the kids kicked off. The control, it felt like it was strangling me.
For Sally, the refuge space, the support, it was life-saving, literally.
There was one point where I was really, really desperate and I was walking because there's a train track. It was that bad. Lots of women get turned away. I came here and I could breathe. It was so secure. The first thing they did was they wrapped their arms around me and reassured me that everything was going to be all right.
With 4 in 10 English councils at risk of essentially becoming bankrupt in the next 5 years, no domestic abuse service feels secure.
I have huge concerns about councils facing bankruptcy and choosing which services are the ones that they fund and which ones they no longer are funding and decommission. And I think we will see more women killed as a result of those decisions, sadly. I think we will see more children stuck in abusive households with no opportunity to escape.
It's a fear shared by the Local Government Association, today acknowledging that ongoing funding pressures are making it increasingly difficult to ensure victims have access to all the help they need. We asked Michael Gove for an interview about the pressures, but we received a statement instead saying, "Our Tackling Domestic Abuse plan is investing over £230 million to drive down the prevalence of domestic abuse. And since 2021, we've committed £507 million to help councils provide support. We recognise councils are facing challenges, and that's why we announced an additional £600 million support package for councils across England." Campaigners acknowledge that money has gone into the system, but say it's still not enough to preserve life-saving services, leaving tough choices for councils, many facing a crisis of their own.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Caroline Noakes, who's chairwoman of the Women and Equalities Committee, and also to Farah Nazir, who's the Chief Executive of Women's Aid. Farah Nazir, give me your assessment of the state of domestic abuse services at the moment.
Almost half, 44% of services are running parts of their service without any dedicated funding whatsoever. And at least half of those services, 23% of those services, are services for children. So what this tells us is that there is a real deficit in the funding for services. It also tells us that children are particularly impacted by this deficit. Further, and completely concerning, very, very worrying, is that there is a huge postcode lottery when it comes to refuge space and community-based services.
And what does it actually mean for women and those children you're talking about?
It means that when a woman and her children or survivors of domestic abuse at large are seeking entry into refuge, there is a 61% refusal rate because there's no capacity within the system to actually respond to those survivors who desperately need to enter into the system of services and get that safe accommodation, get that refuge.
Caroline Noakes, it is a bleak picture that's been painted. Things are not working properly, are they?
There is a really interesting and important question around whether domestic abuse services should be made statutory, whether they should be on a par with children's services and adult services. I think that's something that the Department for Levelling Up should be working hand in hand with local authorities to secure, to be quite frank, because we know that the cost of domestic abuse is absolutely enormous, not just to women and children, but also to wider society.
In the current climate, how likely is that, though, to put more burden on local authorities, which, as we know, are really squeezed as it is?
Well, there's the challenge. And government has to make choices. What we have seen over the course of the last few years is additional funding go into the sector. And I really welcome initiatives like the Flee Fund, which has helped women in desperate circumstances flee abusive partners. But the stark reality is we need to make sure that they can stay in safety, that once they flee, there is somewhere for them to go. And I think it's time, certainly in Parliament, we had a very frank debate about why our services, specifically aimed at women and children in this instance, why are they not on a statutory footing? And I think they should be.
Your own audit acknowledges that more money has gone into the system. Why is it not enough?
Well, I think that's a question that needs to be answered by political decision makers. Why is it not enough? I mean, currently we estimate about £229 million goes into the system to fund domestic abuse services. We think that that should be £427 million. £427 million might sound like a lot, but in the balance of the public purse, it is a very small amount of money when it comes to saving the lives of thousands of women and children every year.
I mean, Caroline Noakes, we talk about it being choices, but we also know the political debate will probably be the government say we are giving more money to local authorities. It is for them to choose how to use it. How do you make this debate go, get somewhere in the end, rather than the government say, well, we've given the money to local authorities saying we don't have enough?
I think we have to look at this as investment rather than spending. And we know that money spent making sure that women are safe, that they have the ability to flee abusive relationships, will actually save money in terms of A&E admissions. It will save money in terms of children requiring additional support at school. It will give greater opportunities to those same women to go out to work and be in a position to support their children going forward.
But local authorities have said, local government associations said today, we recognise the needs of women and victims, children, but we have competing demands, and that's true, isn't it?
And that's the situation that a lot of local authorities over the next few weeks are in, setting their budgets, running consultations as to potential saving measures. And I think the stark reality is that centrally and locally there needs to be much more joined up thinking as to how you can approach the challenge of sufficient funding for domestic abuse services so that actually that can be a release of funds from the health service further down the line.
It's 50 years since Women's Aid came into being. I just wonder, we talk much more about domestic violence now. It's less a problem behind closed doors and only behind closed doors. What still needs to change, though?
We need to ensure that this really welcome heightened awareness of domestic abuse, of violence against women and girls at large, translates into actual action and political decision-making.
And Caroline, no, briefly to you, I mean, your committee, what will your message from your committee be to government?
We know that in the region of 100 women will have lost their lives over the course of the last year, and that will be highlighted in Parliament on the International Women's Day debate. We have a long way to go yet, and we have to tackle the underlying causes of domestic abuse.
Caroline Noakes, Farah Nazir, thank you both for talking to me this evening. And if you need any support after that discussion, you can find more information and links at channel4.com/support.